Welcome everyone to this Thursday evening talk, co-sponsored by the AIA LA. We're very happy to see you all here. This evening we have Dr. Justin Walsh, who is Associate Professor of Art History and Archaeology and Interim Chair of the Department of Art at Chapman University. He has almost 25 years of archaeological experience working on sites in the US, Spain, Jordan, Italy, and most recently, low Earth orbit. He currently directs the Chapman excavations at Castello project in southern Spain and co-directs the International Space Station Archaeological Project. Walsh has been the recipient of various honors, including a Fulbright to Greece, a Rome Prize, and the Benjamin Meeker Distinguished Visiting Professorship at the University of Bristol. We are very honored to have him here with us tonight, so please join me in welcoming Justin Walsh.
Thank you very much, Ken. Can you hear me all right? Perfect. Okay, thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to present to the LA and Riverside County local societies. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am presenting to you from the traditional and unceded lands of the Tongva people who still live in this place and care for it. I pay my respects to their Honu Kuvetam ancestors, Ahi I Hiram elders, and Ayu Inkem relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. Because land acknowledgements can often appear to be empty performative gestures, I also want to signal my personal support for and solidarity with the land back movement as a means of disrupting settler colonialist paradigms. The work I am presenting here may seem unfamiliar and challenging to mainstream archaeological understandings, so I will start with a brief definition of space archaeology. First, it is a subfield of contemporary archaeology, which has used archaeological techniques and perspectives to study our present-day society since the 1970s. Space archaeology, which emerged already in the late 1990s, is concerned with the archaeological evidence, especially what we call material culture, that is, objects and built spaces of architecture, which is the result either of human activity in space or of human activity on Earth that is directed at space. You may have heard other people use the term to describe the use of imagery of terrestrial archaeological sites made by orbiting satellites, but that is not how space archaeologists use it. We would categorize that simply as a form of remote sensing instead. The first space archaeology project was a study by Dr. Beth O'Leary called the Lunar Legacy Project, which ran from 1999 to 2002. O'Leary was interested to find out what had been left behind at the Apollo 11 landing site, Tranquility Base, in 1969. Using a full range of NASA documents, she was ultimately able to identify 106 objects, some of which were scientific equipment that was always intended to remain on the moon, like a seismograph. But others, like boot covers, were thrown out the door of the lunar module just minutes before takeoff in an effort to lighten the spacecraft's load now that hundreds of pounds of rocks and soil had been brought on board. All of the things left behind can be seen as informative about the, quote, Apollo culture of the day, which can be described as competitive, masculine, associated with the Cold War, in contrast, say, to the cooperative and multi-gender, multi-ethnic ISS culture, which I'll be describing in a little bit. Here you can see a map created by O'Leary based on her research. This is the lunar module right here. You can see the paths of the astronauts in the landscape, and here this hatched area, which is what she refers to as the toss zone of items that were just simply thrown out of the door of the lunar module, all of which is still there, and the site is essentially pristine, waiting for archaeologists to return and catalog the items in situ. It's worth thinking about other kinds of items that humans have brought to space with them too, things that are more clearly culturally meaningful. For example, the family photo in a small baggie left by astronaut Charles Duke in 1972, or the Fallen Astronaut Memorial, consisting of a small abstract titanium sculpture and a card printed with the names of all the astronauts and cosmonauts known at the time in 1971 to have died in their work. We can also look at evidence for human activity elsewhere, such as robotic probes on Mars, Venus, Titan, or even in deep space. Here we see a photo taken by the Opportunity rover in 2004 when it happened to roll past the impact site of its own heat shield, which you can see over here. Here's the impact, obviously, a few weeks after it landed. Or examine what I like to call the curiosity and perseverance archaeological landscapes, similarly formed by the various items associated with landing of those rovers and the rovers' ongoing tracks in the soil, their drill locations, etc. In orbit around Earth, there are examples of human technology dating back to the Vanguard 1 satellite in 1958, the oldest item still in orbit. Sputnik, which was launched in 1957, deorbited after 3 months. What you're looking at here is another of the Vanguard series, which did not launch. There was a launch failure and it was retrieved from the launch site and placed in the museum collection. But this shows you basically what Vanguard looked like, or looks like, I should say. And as I mentioned earlier, space archaeology also exists on Earth. For example, the famous quote unquote spacecraft graveyard in the South Pacific Ocean, where spacecraft are aimed to splash down when they are deorbited. And sites where rockets are launched or developed, such as launch pads, here on the left in the foreground, Launch Pad 34 at Cape Canaveral, site of the Apollo 1 fire in 1967, or sites of scientific instruments for examining space, like the Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico, also fall under the rubric of space archaeology. My project, which I co-direct with Dr. Alice Gorman of Flinders University in Adelaide, Australia, studies the International Space Station as an archaeological site. We are inspired by a description of a crewed spacecraft that appears in a 1972 National Academy of Science report on long-duration spaceflight, that a spacecraft is, quote, a micro-society in a mini-world. ISAP is the first full-scale archaeological investigation of a human habitation site in space, using the station's material culture as evidence. We have a number of goals: to understand human adaptations to a completely new environment, one very different from the context in which our species evolved. We are interested in disjunctions between the planned and actual uses of different parts of a space habitat. We are interested in demonstrating how social science perspectives can be used to improve life in space. And of course, we are extending the discipline of archaeology into a totally new context. Now, you might say, why is archaeology relevant to space travel? Can't you just ask the crew about their experiences? Don't space agencies already know what's going on in their spacecraft? Everything is planned to the nth degree. There are cameras all over the place. The answer to these last two questions, perhaps surprisingly, is only sort of. While we certainly can talk to crews about their experiences and have already done so, it has to be remembered that astronauts are only human. Just like anybody else, they don't have perfect memories, and they might have trouble articulating their experiences to researchers. In fact, they have good reasons for not being completely open. They are very good at staying on message, and they want to make sure they don't jeopardize future opportunities to go back to space. They don't want to rock the boat. As for the space agencies, their focus is very much on the present and the future, not the past and what can be learned from it. So while the astronauts' time on ISS is scheduled to 5-minute increments, the ways in which those schedules change in response to new contingencies are not preserved, and no analysis is done about how facilities are used, when, or by whom. Archaeology is explicitly concerned with these problems and provides a means for generating answers, even without firsthand accounts. The project got its start thanks to two events which occurred in late 2015. First, I happened to be following NASA on Twitter and saw them advertise for new astronaut candidates. They ultimately received 18,000 applications for just 12 spots. Looking at the call for applications, I noticed something surprising. While they welcomed folks with STEM degrees at any level, social scientists, even with a PhD, were prohibited from applying. As you can see here, the following degree fields, while related to engineering and the sciences, are not considered qualifying: degrees in social sciences. More specifically, they called out geographers, anthropologists, and yes, archaeologists. Keep in mind that astronauts almost never perform work in the area of their academic specialization, but they're expected to be Jacks and Jills of all trades. On the one hand, I was kind of impressed that they were even thinking about us, but it also seemed frankly ridiculous that they were so sure they didn't want to hear from us, especially since NASA is planning a 3-year round-trip mission to Mars. You should want to know about the social and cultural aspects of your crew's lives if you're going to put them in a spacecraft for that long. Indeed, there have been decades of biomedical and psychological research on spaceflight, but hardly any from the social sciences. And NASA is far from alone in this policy. There has never been a social scientist astronaut and no space agency, until the Japanese agency's current recruitment that just started in January, has ever welcomed people with degrees outside of STEM or medicine. So how could I demonstrate the utility of our field to space agencies and the space industry? What site would make sense to study? ISS seemed like a no-brainer because it has been continuously occupied since November 2000, and more than 250 people have visited it. It's a joint project of 5 space agencies representing the US, Japan, Europe, Canada, and Russia. It is possibly the single most expensive building project in history, costing somewhere around $150 billion so far. But how could I study it when I quite obviously could not go there? Archaeological research has always seemed like you need to be present at the site or in the landscape you're studying. Well, at the same time, I happened to be reading Jason de Leon's new book, The Land of Open Graves, Living and Dying on the Migrant Trail. Many of you know Jason because he's now at UCLA, but if you don't know his undocumented migration project, he studies the experiences of migrants crossing borders, such as the Sonoran Desert, from Mexico into the US, using a variety of anthropological and archaeological techniques. One method he used was to give disposable cameras to migrants in Mexico, retrieving them on the other side of the border, allowing him to see aspects of the journey that he could not otherwise observe. Here, you see one such image. Reading this, the concept clicked for me. The crew of ISS had been taking photos all along. And since occupation of ISS coincided with the rise of digital photography, there were thousands more images than exist from previous space missions. And they have metadata telling exactly when they were made. If we could get data such as the identities of the people in the images, their location in ISS, and the types of objects surrounding them, we could organize them in chronological order, and voila, we could map the patterns of behavior and associations across the entirety of the site's occupation. At this point, I reached out to Alice, since I knew her prior work on orbital space debris, and she agreed to join me on the project. So, if we creatively reimagine archaeological methods, we can gain access to ISS's material culture. Now I'd like to present a pilot study that shows how we put this technique into action and what results can be achieved. Here I offer some examples of how photos document various aspects of life on ISS. So exercise, picking photos out the window, science, and other kinds of technical work, eating and drinking, sleep, and rest. Since tagging all of the people, places, and things in the photos manually would be time prohibitive, we are in the process of developing artificial intelligence / machine learning techniques for automating this in collaboration with computer science colleagues at Chapman. Okay, so now our pilot study. First, an introduction to the geography of our site. In this stunning image taken in October 2021, we can see the whole site plan. ISS is divided into 2 primary segments designated US at the front of the station in blue, and Russian towards the aft in yellow. Europe has one module right here, a lab named Columbus, and Japan has one too, also a lab called Kibo. Then we have the US modules here, and then we have Russian modules extending back. So this is the front of the station, this is the back. And directions are given on ISS, like on a ship, forward and aft, starboard and port, based on the direction of travel. As I was examining the roughly 8,000 images that NASA has published from ISS on its Flickr site, I noticed this particular photo. It shows 2 professional astronauts, one American, one Japanese, with a Hungarian-American space tourist, in the Russian service module known as Zvezda. I was particularly struck, as you may be, by the plethora of items on the aft wall of the module behind the men. There are flags and mission patches, photographs of Russian space heroes and landscape paintings, toys, and even a gold Orthodox cross. To give you a sense of the space, here is a diagram of the Zvezda module. The aft wall has an upper area in blue between two air vents, and a lower area set back in orange, which I call the niche. I began to wonder whether these, oh, by the way, the yellow is the door into one of the two crew berths that are located in this part of the space station, just to explain that. I began to wonder whether these items were always there. As you can see from this slideshow, which spans the first 14 years of ISS's occupation, the answer is no. The wall has always had items on it, but they are added and taken down, moved around. I created a database to record every unique item, 78 of them, and their location in 48 different photographs, chosen because they showed some difference in arrangement from the previous one. This data collection allowed me to chart the number of items over time. As you can see, the number does not go from 0 at the beginning to 78 at the end, but shows patterns of growth and decline. So early few, then a lot, then few, then a lot, then few, then a lot. It's kind of like a sine wave pattern. We can also break out religious items, such as icons and the cross, here in red, from the secular items in blue. And note that even early on, when there are many items in total, there are relatively few which are religious, while later on, when there are many items, a much larger proportion is religious in nature. These changes can be attributed to changes in the crew and their individual beliefs and interests, as well as events back home, such as the 60th anniversary of the end of World War II in 2005, the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, or the buildup to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. There were patterns as well in the locations of different kinds of items, as you see here. So photographs tend to appear down below in the niche. These are of Soviet space heroes. The icons instead tend to be up high. Other religious items, especially crosses, are often in the niche. The flags and the mission patches appear in the top area. So we can figure out these different patterns of display that are kind of interesting and not previously noticed or documented. The most common item to appear was a copy of a very famous photograph of Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space. It first showed up on ISS in Expedition 2 in 2001 and was seen on the wall from Expedition 5 in 2002. It is, in fact, the only item that has remained consistently on the wall the entire time surveyed in our study, and it has remained there even to the present day, indicating Gagarin's role as a kind of secular saint for cosmonauts. The second most common item to appear is a miraculous icon, known as the Mother of God of Kazan, which appeared in half of all the photos. Here you can see a more recent image showing that this tradition still exists. You see all the different items here, the gold cross up there, photographs of space heroes in the niche down below. There are some flags as well, mission patches, etc. This is still absolutely going on. Indeed, the interplay between the Zvezda visual display and current events is vividly present right now on ISS. Japanese space tourist Yusaku Maezawa, who visited ISS on a Russian flight in December 2021, made videos that gave a good view of the state of Zvezda at that time. So this is the niche right here. You can see actually images of Alexei Leonov, the first person to walk in space, and an additional different image of Yuri Gagarin located in that area. In one video, it was possible to see a new icon over the door of the berth of, here's the berth door, icon here, of the cosmonaut Anton Shkaplerov, who is currently the commander of ISS. Shkaplerov was born and raised in Sevastopol, the largest city in Crimea. My colleague, Dr. Wendy Salmond, a Russian art historian, has identified the icon as portraying Saint Fedor Ushakov, who was canonized in 2001 and is the patron of the Russian Navy. He founded the naval fortress at Sevastopol in the 18th century. The icon therefore seems related to Shkaplerov's hometown in the disputed zone of Crimea an expression of its Russianness and orthodoxy. I am sure that none of the non-Russian partner agencies are aware of the significance of this object. It is likely that the non-Russian crew of ISS are equally unaware. We have also been able to trace the phenomenon of such visual displays, especially of Russian space heroes like Gagarin, or the earliest theorist of spaceflight, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, and religious objects like icons to previous space stations. In other words, this is a traditional practice of cosmonauts developed and reinforced over decades. Here we see the aft wall of the Mir core module, which, not incidentally, was the architectural predecessor of Zvezda. In fact, Zvezda was initially designed and constructed as the core of what was to have been the Mir 2 station before the International Space Station project was fully developed. Above the crew's heads are another famous image of Gagarin, flanked by two icons in presentation cases. And you can see the air vents on either side. It tells you that this really is the same architecture. In another photo, NASA astronaut Jerry Linenger floats in front of the aft wall, where the image of Gagarin is now flanked by a simple landscape painting and a portrait of Tsiolkovsky. A calendar with a portrait of the third major Russian space hero, Sergei Korolev, the first chief designer of the Soviet space program, is visible at right. The tradition of display is even found on the previous generation of Soviet space stations, the Salyuts. Again, the same design. This time we're actually looking forward rather than aft, so that's not the same wall. But you can see the picture of Yuri Gagarin right here. He also appears behind two cosmonauts on that, so that previous one was Salyut 7 between 1983 and 1986. Here he appears between two cosmonauts on Salyut 5 in 1976. These heroes were common features of Soviet popular culture, as can be seen in this film still from the 1972 film Solaris, where they formed the backdrop to a meeting of an investigative space commission. Cosmonauts frequently visited multiple space stations during their careers, so the tradition was simply reenacted in each new context. What is particularly interesting is that the designers of the spacecraft made no accommodations for the displays. There are no frames or fasteners, nothing to say, this is a good place to hang something. The crew is simply being opportunistic, taking advantage of some empty space that could be easily seen in order to express themselves. What I've just presented was an early phase of our work, with the bulk of it done in 2017. This was the time when we were just starting to build our relationship with the NASA ISS Research Integration Office. They were, unsurprisingly, given the bias we already knew existed in NASA against social science research, unsure what to make of us. But when I sent our preliminary results from the Zvezda display to our contact there, the penny dropped for him. He said, I've been looking at that wall since the beginning, and I knew there was stuff up there, but I didn't know what it was or that it changed. A few months later, I found myself watching the return of a SpaceX cargo Dragon vehicle to Earth. Since the end of the space shuttle program, the only way that items return from ISS is on a Dragon. And I wondered about what happens to the things that come back. These are the only remnants of ISS material culture that could be directly available to us. And they're being removed from their original context. In a sense, they're being discarded from ISS. Discard, trash. This is quintessentially archaeological material, right? Now, actual trash is usually put on the other cargo resupply vehicles, such as Northrop Grumman's Cygnus capsule, where it's designed to burn up during atmospheric reentry. The items that come back on Dragon, then, are not trash, but have a different meaning that can be seen in the costly and elaborate processes used to remove them from ISS. In fact, we might compare them to the expensive grave goods carefully placed in an elite tomb to honor the dead. They are no longer available for the society which created them, but are valuable nonetheless. Put these in contrast with the millions of pottery fragments found discarded at practically any ancient site, for example, in the Mediterranean, abundant, low value, thrown away, destroyed. As I said, archaeologists are used to interpreting items based on how they were abandoned or removed from systemic contexts. So I reached out to our contact in the Research Integration Office and asked if we could observe the return of cargo on Dragon. And thanks to the Zvezda pilot study, he was supportive. He was able to get us permission to watch and interview the teams of contractors that received the cargo on 2 separate flights, CRS 13 and 14 in January and May of 2018, respectively. In the end, we interviewed 24 individual contractors. Alice and I recruited a sociologist of science, Paula Castaño, who had already studied various ISX experiments in her doctoral work, to help us work through the interview data. We also had help from Chapman student Ashley Lee in transcribing the interviews. At the time of our observations, the vehicles landed in the Pacific Ocean, a few hundred miles off the coast of Southern California and Mexico. The SpaceX recovery team brought the capsules back to port in Long Beach and then turned the cargo off the teams employed by 2 contractors, Jacobs Engineering Group, which handled refrigerated items, and Leidos, which was in charge of the non-temperature sensitive items, i.e. everything else. And here you're seeing some of the workspaces of the 2 groups. This is the Jacobs Engineering Group. These are portable refrigerators that can refrigerate down to -80 Celsius, and the battery packs that power them. And this is the workspace of the Leidos group in their cargo processing facility. The refrigerated items were immediately flown back from Long Beach to Houston on a charter plane, while the rest was sent there by truck. Here you see one of the bags being unpacked. I apologize for the kind of strobe-like effect here. I hope it's okay. We'll move on from this slide shortly, but this is to show you the process of unpacking one of these bags, what the things are like inside. Finally, the various other items were carefully unpacked, cataloged, documented in photos, and then returned to their owners, typically academic researchers, commercial companies, participant space agencies, and even the astronauts themselves. Here we're seeing a couple of folks who work for Leidos, who are unpacking one of the cargo transfer bags, and they're cross-checking a list of items. They're calling out the numbers, and these are the people who are receiving them, and everybody is saying, is that the right thing? That's the right thing. Okay, proceed to the next thing. It's all very carefully regimented. Likewise, here is the cold stowage team moving things from a portable refrigerator down here. This is on their charter plane, to a cardboard box, an insulated cardboard box full of dry ice. Every item is pulled out quickly. The refrigerator is closed. It is held up. It is photographed. It is video recorded, and its name and number are said, and then it's placed into the dry ice. It's like a military operation. Both as a habitat and a system of social relations, ISS is a world that's packed with objects and procedures. As of August 2020, the station's inventory management database recorded over 330,000 items. The records for some 77,000 of these are currently considered active on station, according to the database managers. Of the remainder, almost 250,000 have either been returned to Earth or destroyed in a deorbiting cargo craft, much more the latter than the former. The use of these objects, whether related to scientific experiments or the maintenance of the crew, is all about procedures. Training, launch, mission control, and the execution of each task inside and outside the station entails the detailed crafting and execution of instructions and delegation of tasks along extended chains of interdependencies involving diverse actors. What then are the items that are worthy, quote unquote, worthy of return from the station instead of being burned up? Based on our assessment of the item descriptions and spreadsheets provided by the contractors, we have categorized the items, 8,702 for the CRS 13 vehicle and 2,218 for CRS 14 that returned from the ISS on the SpaceX vehicles. We've divided them into 6 functional groups, and I credit our database engineer, Amir Kanan-Kashefi, for wrangling this data. First, scientific or commercial samples from studies carried out in space, including live animals, dissected animal parts, and samples of human bodily fluids. The items that require temperature management have been separated out in the figures as cold stowage, you see here on the left. So you've got samples and cold stowage. Used or broken equipment that one agency or another wants to study for improvement and or fix and replace. We also break out items such as spacesuits used during extravehicular activities and electronic equipment in our analysis. Third, crew personal items such as family photos, musical instruments, books, games, or clothing. This also includes items used by crew in personal maintenance and hygiene. Fourth, storage items such as cargo transfer bags or Ziploc plastic bags, which don't have an explanation of their contents. 5, memorabilia or other items used by space agencies for public affairs purposes. And sixth, fillers, that is old clothing or even food waste containers that are not returned for their own value, but instead are used to fill in voids in the departing spacecraft so that the cargo can't shift during deorbit. These items are deemed irrelevant from the point of view of the space agencies, but they're clearly important from an archaeological perspective. The cargo team attempts to return clothing to the crew member who owned it. As you can see here, samples, storage, and equipment items comprise by far the largest groups of returned items on the CRS-14 flight, both by the number of listings and the individual items under each listed type. Personal items comprise the smallest group. Those are the items, of course, that are specifically related to the crew. Another way to categorize the returned items is by their NASA, quote, system designation. That is, by the activity that they pertain to, such as crew healthcare, flight controls, or command and data handling. From this chart, we can see that 56% of the items on SpaceX CRS-13 were payloads such as samples or hard drives, while the remaining 44% were equipment belonging to the various ISS support systems. Almost all the material in the category international partner, ESA, the gray here, were public affairs items for the Italian space agency ASI, whose crew member Paolo Nespoli had returned to Earth just 1 month earlier, including flags, t-shirts, and pennants. There were also 2 experimental items in this category, including the beloved IS Espresso coffee maker. One aspect of the cold stowage team's responsibilities is worthy of note for how it illustrates the level of care and attention shown by NASA for the items selected for return. The temperature of the freezers, and here you actually see these are samples, frozen samples that have just been taken out of a refrigerator. This is actually an image that shows how carefully they plan out the packing of each bag, how every item has to be oriented in a particular way. The temperature of the freezers holding returned items is checked and noted on a form at 15 or 30-minute intervals from the moment cold stowage receives the cargo until it's placed in the lab freezers, including during the flight from Long Beach to Houston. The meticulous nature of this requirement is such that when the cold stowage team is transporting its cargo just 20 minutes by truck from Ellington Field to Johnson Space Center, they take a scheduled stop in a specific strip mall parking lot along the way to recheck the temperatures, because it's just too long a drive. Even the non-temperature controlled items receive extraordinary care, such as these detached strings carefully placed in resealable bags in the hope that their owner will be found. Like the scientific samples, the personal items of the crew are treated in a very specific way, one that entails confidentiality in response to the principle of crew privacy. Crew choose their personal items in a separate room from the rest of the stock, and the items are packed and handled by different personnel from the bulk of the cargo. The crew preference bags, as they're called, are considered to have confidential status, which is taken very seriously because for the most part, crew only have tiny berths to store their belongings and express their personality. Personal items are those used by crew for their own hygiene and maintenance outside of the daily work of the station, such as clothing, toothbrushes, shampoo, and specific food items, and items which are packed into their personal preference kit or PPK. The tradition of the PPK started with the Gemini human spaceflight program in the 1960s and has gone through several evolutions for Apollo and shuttle missions. Typically, the PPK includes family photos, organizational flags, t-shirts, ball caps, books, religious texts, and personal mementos. And this is the only public photo that I'm aware of that shows what this looks like. This was the French astronaut Thomas Pesquet tweeted out this photo showing the kinds of things that were in his, and because he was excited that they had come back. Some of the personal items, such as family photographs, are clearly related to the crew members' need to feel connected to family and home during their time away, and this practice can be tied to maintaining a sense of well-being. It is also very common for crew to include objects for gifts or distribution back on Earth, as even the most mundane object acquires a special cachet by virtue of being space-flown. Due to the limited space, these objects are often flat, small, and/or lightweight, such as flags, patches, coins, and stamps. And Thomas Pesquet, whose things you see here, also carried his friends' wedding bands in advance of their wedding ceremony, and brought them back for them. A crew member will also include items or insignia from organizations important in their own lives, such as sports teams. These practices give us significant insights into the regulated, documented, and scheduled nature of life on the station and the small degree of autonomy that ISS crew members have in relation to objects. In a platform where every action entails a procedure and every object is part of an inventory, the astronauts' selection of the personal items they want to bring in return is the only activity that remains discretional and confidential. In the two domains of items, there's also a bifurcation regarding the role of astronauts. In the case of samples, they are themselves objectified as anonymized data points. On the other hand, regarding their own items and their choice, they are individual humans experiencing something personal and unique. And I think it's also worth considering the crew's perspective on the return process and the items. They likely have an interest in the scientific findings stemming from their very close relationship with the scientific samples from their own bodies. The process of producing the samples is reinforced by packing and documenting them, which connects them with ISS's larger scientific mission. At the same time, the personal items are possibly the only tangible connection to home for crew members while they're in space, and the only tangible connection to their time in space once they return to Earth. I'd like to turn now to a more recent use of the photographs of life on ISS to illustrate another way in which the perspective of archaeologists can provide totally new insights into how a space habitat is used. As I previously noted, we have been collaborating with computer scientists to figure out ways to get data out of the photos. In this case, again, using the 8,000 photos on Flickr, we were able to scrape the captions for each one. They typically give lots of information on what's in the photos. For example, here, Drew Morgan and Jessica Meir work on the waste and hygiene compartment in the Tranquility module. From this, we can extrapolate that the photo contains two people, a male American NASA astronaut and a female American NASA astronaut, and one location, Tranquility, also known as Node 3. Doing this for all of the photos, or actually just 6,000 of the 8,000, since 1/4 of them either didn't list a name or a location in the caption, we were able to map, for the first time, population distributions by module across the life of ISS. Amir Kanan Kashefi and Chapman PhD student Rao Hamza Ali are responsible for doing the data scraping and organizing here. I want to underline that what we're doing here is something that no space agency has done. In fact, they would not be able to tell you who was using what parts of their own spacecraft. But the associations of different parts of a site with different categories of people is a fundamentally archaeological question. Here, I present two analyses, one by gender and the other by nationality. In the first 20 years of occupation, the ISS population has been 84% men and 16% women. You can see this proportion represented in the bar at the far right that says population. The other bars represent the various modules, more or less from the front of the space station to the back, roughly divided between the US orbital segment, which is these bars from Kibo to Cupola, and the Russian segment being Zarya through Zvezda. It is clear that in the Russian segment, women are much less visible in the historic photographs, as you can see from the blue sections of the bars. A fact that's less surprising if we consider that Russia has only sent one female cosmonaut to ISS so far. But in some parts of the US segment, such as Node 1, the location of the galley, and Node 3, location of exercise and hygiene, women are also not seen as often as their proportion of the larger population would suggest. By contrast, take a look at the bar for the cupola, where the large observation window facing Earth is located. Women make up 24% of all people seen in the cupola, 50% higher than their actual proportion of the population. What could explain this phenomenon? Well, we suggest that the fact that the Flickr photos that are the basis for this study were chosen for publication by NASA Public Affairs, whose priority is promoting a positive view of the agency's activities. And this may be part of the issue. Whether purposely or unconsciously, there may be a bias towards showing women in an aesthetically pleasing context, rather than one associated with eating or working out. Now, let's just say as an aside, when I explained this phenomenon to the head of ISS research in a meeting in January, she said, "That hit me right here," gesturing to her gut. And I didn't like it. So there seems to be some bias in these photos because of how they were chosen and published. Even so, our analysis of population distributions is not completely compromised. And that's borne out, for example, by the difference between the Russian and the US segments for gender. We can also see this in the distribution across modules by nationality, as you see here. So in this case, again, this is the general population bar, the actual population bar, where the salmon color is the Russian contingent, the light blue color is the Americans, and again, organized US segment to here and Russian segment here. So it's clear, for example, that the Russians dominate in the Russian segment and the Americans dominate in the US segment. The brown color, representing Japanese crew, makes up a large proportion of people seen in the Japanese module compared to their actual proportion of the population. And likewise, the gray, representing the Italians, is a large proportion of people in the European module. Again, here are the Italians, their actual population. These distributions raise the question of how international the International Space Station really is, when it clearly contains national zones. We can see this in a further analysis using a statistical test, you'll just have to trust me, that shows how diverse each module is by nationality, where on this scale, one would represent a completely even distribution of groups in a module. In other words, all groups have the same number of people in a module. And 0 would mean the exclusive use of a module by just one group out of many. We can see that there is no fully international module of ISS. Is this an optimal distribution of people? I ask because, as previously noted, ISS is perhaps the most expensive building project in the history of humanity. And you would think that you would want everybody living and working everywhere. Instead, as a function of a management structure that's decentralized, with each agency deciding separately what will happen in their facilities and with their crews, it looks like ISS is actually relatively inefficient. This is an important issue, as 4 of the 5 partner agencies are now working to build their next space station to go into orbit around the moon. And NASA is funding 4 separate commercial groups to build their own space stations in the next decade. And it shows that archaeology can have practical results by providing data-driven insights that are valuable for improving future life in space. It also shows the utility of developing methods to exploit new kinds of data sets, like historic photography, for archaeological research on sites that archaeologists can't visit directly. Imagine a study of the material culture of Antarctic research stations, or of the summit of Mount Everest using historic photography. By the way, if you use that idea, please let me know. I think it would be awesome if somebody did that. Finally, maybe what you've been waiting for, I would like to describe our current work that is actually happening on ISS right now. We had been planning in situ experiments from the very beginning of our project, but it took years to lay the foundations for them by building a relationship with the Center for Advancement of Science in Space, or CASIS, a nonprofit organization that runs the ISS National Lab, and which has allocations of crew time, up mass, and down mass, which it provides to researchers. We also needed funding to pay for the analysis of samples, for which we applied to the National Science Foundation in 2020 and 2021. Ultimately, we designed 7 different experiments, everything from sampling the air and soil for microparticles related to different kinds of activities, to recording sound to identify how privacy is constructed on a space station, to using photo and video in directed ways, rather than the essentially random historic photos to document areas we were interested in, such as stowage areas and crew berths. While we were waiting to hear about funding, though, CASIS reached out and asked if we had an experiment that could be done without launching any equipment. They had a window of opportunity due to other experiments dropping out and an excess of crew time. As it happened, one of our experiments needed nothing more than some adhesive tape, a ruler, a color calibration card, and a camera, all of which are already on board. The idea behind the experiment, which came from my co-PI, Alice Gorman, is to replicate the most basic archaeological technique, the shovel test pit, to scientifically sample different areas of ISS over time. So here you see an example of a shovel test pit. When you go to a site, if you're not doing remote sensing, certainly in the old days, this is how you would figure out what your larger strategy would be for excavating. You would lay out a grid with 1 meter squares, and you would dig them relatively quickly to help you strategize where to dig next. We call this experiment, or we call this, as they call it, a payload, in fact, the Sampling Quadrangle Assemblages Research Experiment, or SQUARE. Everything in space has an acronym, and this is our contribution to the culture. We designated 5 locations and asked the crew to designate a 6th one that they thought might be interesting for the placement of 1-meter squares that would be photographed once a day at the same time for 30 days, and then once a day at a randomly chosen time for 30 days. Each image is a single context representing a moment in time, not unlike a stratum of soil. We have chosen 2 areas normally associated with science, one with eating, one with hygiene, and one with work/maintenance. The crew selected area is another one where various non-science work tasks happen. Some areas are more active than others, which is ideal for showing us the difference between low and high activity. I'll just show you, here are just some examples. These are actually images, or this is actually an image that I sent to NASA to show what we wanted to do. This is the galley table in node 1, and the yellow square obviously represents the area that we wanted to capture. Using the photos, Alice and I are recording both the kinds of items and their locations. We also record whether the items persist over time, that is to say, from one photo to the next, which is obviously something that doesn't happen in terrestrial trenches. If you found the same object twice in the same trench, that would really be a problem. On January 14th, NASA astronaut Kayla Barron set up, is this going to play? Oh, get my pointer back. Supposed to be able to watch this video. Where's the video? Oh, this is really aggravating. This is the video showing her doing it. Okay, we'll just have to move on. I apologize. Maybe later I can bring it back. On January 14th, NASA astronaut Kayla Barron set up the first archaeological experiment ever to happen off of the Earth, and the crew has been taking photos since January 21st. In this video, it represents what I consider to be a historic moment for our field, as she placed the first pieces of tape to designate an archaeological sample location in space in the Japanese experiment module, also known as Kibo. It was 2 p.m. on ISS, 6 a.m. here in California, and 1 a.m. in Australia as we watched live video via Teams video conference. We finished the first phase of photos. Here you see Kayla making a photo on February 20th, and they will conclude on March 22nd. Here you see the very first photo documenting an archaeological context in space, showing the starboard workstation in the US Node 2 module. And I know you're saying, how is this a square? We're using these yellow pieces of tape to delineate corners, like so. And we're capturing information about whatever is within the boundaries of that square. It's obviously too early to describe any concrete conclusions from this experiment. Even now, we are not sure what we're going to find when we analyze the final results. We do have some interesting images in many locations. For example, showing the deployment of a portable glove bag, showing the use of the Node 2 workstation for science as well as maintenance. You can see the precarity of the bag, which must be being used because the permanent glove boxes in other parts of ISS are already in use or unavailable. Its top is held up and in place using a carabiner attached to a bungee cord. And in some photos of this area, we can also see a video camera and an LED light, which can be seen in the upper left corner of the square, indicating that the work is monitored from the ground in real time. In other words, the flexibility of the space and its function are evident. We later learned from social media posts that ESA European Space Agency astronaut Matthias Maurer was performing an experiment to see how concrete sets in microgravity conditions, and that these tubes, which you might be able to make out in the glove box, they contain the concrete. But I want to underline that even without that information, we are still able to understand very well what is happening in this location from careful observation of the material culture present in our photos. A few other examples. In the galley in node 1, we see an ebook right here. Evidence that the crew likes to read while eating. An activity that probably everyone here can recognize as typical for someone dining alone, but not one known from prior documentation of life in a space habitat. We even see an actual book, physical book, stowed temporarily in this area in another image. And there's evidence for cooking and / baking here in the form of icing and frosting, these tubes in the Ziploc bag. that was used to make a birthday cake, which Kayla Barron posted on Instagram, as you see here, after we saw this image, a birthday cake for a fellow crew member, for Pyotr Dubrov, one of the cosmonauts. Here are views of the other squares. Nobody has seen these images, by the way, you're the first. This is one of the science areas. This is the square in Kibo that we saw the still image of Kayla setting up. This was the first piece of tape here, the upper right corner, lower right corner, upper left corner. There actually is no fourth corner here because of the cables. So we use the third corner to mark, we use these two corners to mark the edges of the square. Here is the Columbus European Space Agency's Columbus lab, another set, a rack full of scientific equipment. And in these two areas, we really didn't expect to see very much activity. And certainly in this area, there's been almost no activity whatsoever, which is great, actually, because it shows us when there's no activity, what does it look like? Here, there's actually been a surprising amount of activity that seems to be related to the experiment that's outside of our square. So the square is here, right there. You can see the other piece of tape here. There's an experiment with growing plants over here, which is why you have that pink and purple light. It's the best frequency for stimulating plant growth. And we see a lot of items being stowed in this location behind the bungee cords, video cameras, laptops. We also have some Ziploc bags with various equipment, for example, communications equipment, that are located here. So it seems to relate to what's going on next to it, which is very interesting. We see objects moving in and out of that space. And here is the crew selected location. This is in the US lab Destiny, right next to the controls for the robotic arm on the station. And we see notes appearing in an actual physical notebook by the crew. We have memory cards with photos, including probably some of the photos that are for our own experiment. So there's kind of a meta aspect to it. Here's one corner of the square. There's another corner down here, another corner here. We've got Huggy wipes in a couple of locations. This is how they clean themselves, pens and markers and all the other stuff. A chain of carabiners. So these do change over time. And finally, this may be my favorite image so far, showing the camaraderie and playfulness of the crew even during work. It's a self-portrait by Mark Van de Hey in the hygiene area of Node 3, joined by, or perhaps photobombed by, Kayla Barron. And it's been exciting and gratifying to see the crew engage with our experiment, including on social media. Matthias Maurer posted on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook this photo, and he added a couple of other photos. So we have, Matthias is here, this is Mark Van de Hey, this is Tom Marshburn, all current occupants of the space station. And I really love these photos on social media, because how are they gonna illustrate what the experiment is? Well, they've got the color calibration card and the ruler held together with a clip and Velcro. And they have the picture, or they have the items in front of them. So that in a sense, what they're taking a photograph of when they're taking photographs of the squares is a photograph of themselves. There's a kind of beautiful metaphor that they realize that the images that they're taking reflect themselves in their own activities. Okay, I will close there. Hopefully this was an interesting look at what we know is an unusual, if not unique, example of archaeology. We've had many successes, not least of which is Square, and the 3 peer-reviewed articles we've published so far in major journals. But I will note that we've also faced many challenges. I mentioned our efforts to gain funding for other experiments on ISS. Just in January, in fact, the day before Kayla placed that first piece of tape for a Square, we were informed that despite scores of very good, excellent, and excellent from 3 external reviewers, and a recommendation of funding at the A priority level by the NSF panel, the program officer declined to fund us because he does not regard contemporary archaeology to be archaeological enough. We've been met with this kind of gatekeeping throughout this project, but we will continue to persevere. One bright note is that we've now met with most of the companies planning new space stations because they're interested in our discoveries and believe that they could be useful for their planning. On Monday, actually, we will be presenting our work to the head of human spaceflight at NASA and the director of the ISS program. And I can promise that we have many more exciting ideas for future work on ISS. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Justin. This is such an interesting expansion of archaeology. I'm sure we have so many questions, and we do have time for questions. So please, if anyone would like to ask Justin anything, feel free to type a question in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask.
I'm going to see if I can get that video working. Here we go. I have the video working. Here's Kayla doing the experiment, or starting the experiment. There's no audio. Sorry for the jumpiness of the video. So she's looking at the procedures, understanding where she has to put the tape that she's got in her hand. And there it is. One small step for archaeologists. So anyway, yeah, anybody have any questions, please feel free to reach out.
Hi, I actually had a question. So my name is Malida Kiritsi-Loper. I'm an anthropology undergraduate, hoping to transfer into UCLA in the fall. But it was a great talk, thank you. And I was just kind of shocked about that first snapshot back in the beginning. Not shocked, but surprised that my discipline, anthropology and archaeology is like kind of barred from being astronauts. So my question, I guess, would be, you kind of touched upon it at the end, but what do you see the future of space archaeology like? And then do you predict that an archaeologist will ever be, or an anthropologist would ever be able to go up to the space station and kind of perform some kind of ethnography of a space habitat?
Hi, Melita. Thanks for that question. I really appreciate it. And congratulations on transferring to UCLA. That's great. Some of your faculty are on this video conference, so I'm sure they're excited to meet you, unless maybe you've already met them. So this is what you're referring to, right? The advertisement and the saying no archaeologists need apply, right? So yeah, that was discouraging. But the fact is that we actually, once people in the space industry get an opportunity to learn what we're all about and what the potential value of what we're doing, they really kind of like, oh, wow, okay, let's talk. Tell us what you can tell us about things we don't know. And the fact is actually, we've kind of expressed this as they don't know yet what they don't know. That's how bad the situation is for them, right? So if you're designing a space station and you're trying to figure out what scientific facilities you're going to put on the space station, you're kind of guessing because you don't know how much facilities in previous space stations have been used, which ones have been more used than others, right? A centrifuge or a furnace or a glove box or whatever, right? So that's going to be an aspect of our study going forward. And they're really interested in that. I would bet you that this project is going to start to open those doors. Now, will an archaeologist or anthropologist get to go to ISS? I highly doubt it because of the amount of time that's left. So obviously, we're in a very weird situation right at the moment with everything that's going on in Ukraine. And there's a lot of discussion about the fact that the current agreement between the international partner agencies only extends to the end of 2024. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they were going to extend it to 2030. There were active discussions about that. Now that seems very doubtful. Even if it were 2030, so far, as I mentioned earlier, only the Japanese Space Agency is even open to accepting applicants from people who are not from a STEM background. It remains to be seen whether in this recruitment they'll actually take people who come from the social sciences, humanities, arts, whatever. It would be great if they did, and that would be the way it would happen. But future avenues for space archaeology, I mean, this is a bad pun, but sky's the limit. As I was saying, what does space archaeology consist of? It's things on other planets, it's things in orbit, it's things here on Earth. You could combine underwater archaeology with space archaeology. You can go and find these items and see what's left of them. What actually remains to hit the water? It probably doesn't completely burn up. We've seen that, for example, with Skylab, the US space station in 1982, which part of it landed in Western Australia. Luckily, an unpopulated or relatively unpopulated part of it. So, and understanding what the condition of that debris is will help mission planners for the future. And then on top of that, you've got the current orbital situation where it's, low Earth orbit is filling up with satellites and satellites and satellites, and you have a space debris problem, right? Okay, so you want to remove those items from space? okay, maybe that's a good idea from a sustainability point of view, but what about a heritage point of view? Are all items created equally? Like, would we want to get Vanguard 1 out of orbit? Or should we leave it there because it's the oldest thing that humans have put in orbit, right? Or other significant, technological advances or culturally significant objects that have been put into orbit. So Alice has really worked a lot on this. How do we develop a kind of a system for determining what's important and what's actually space junk? This is where archaeologists are going to be really needed. So I think that there's lots of opportunities.
Thank you.
Justin, I have a question.
Choose.
So, you're bringing traditional archaeological methods to space with some of adaptation. I'm wondering if there's a recursive influence on your methodology other than the fact that you're in a weightless environment and other things that you have to contend with. And in particular, I'm thinking of the measurement of time, because you said something about when something was taken, and then you had to qualify it in another time zone. And of course, in aviation and space, the Universal Time Coordinated, or Zulu time, is a standard way of doing things. Now in archaeology, we do things in, metric system, whereas you used to have kind of maybe more than one, or the royal foot or whatever. But I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts are on that, and whether or not you're going to, maybe among other things, adopt Zulu time.
So, well, ISS is on UTC, or basically Greenwich Mean Time. So that was the 8-hour time difference between here and Kayla doing that work. It was right after lunch for her. We woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning to see it here in LA. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure how big an impact that particularly has. I will say our project has had to deal with it with Alice in Australia and me here. And actually we have collaborators around the world. We've all been doing Zoom, but one of the Zoom or a couple of Zoom meetings we've had have involved 16 time zones. So that has been very difficult to schedule. And so somebody has to be up at midnight or 2 in the morning. It's unavoidable if we're going to be able to schedule any meeting. As far as measurements are concerned, well, of course, we're using the metric system, but it was interesting that the dimensions that were measured by Kayla came to us in inches. They have tape measures on board that are dual imperial and metric units, but she recorded them in imperial units, so we've had to convert those. I don't know. It's everything is metric. It's not really a big deal. Maybe I'm not fully answering your question. I'm not sure, but
no, that's more or less it. I'm just kind of wondering if there are other conventions that you can see changing or adopting given the circumstances.
Well, it's not so much about conventions as methods to me, right? That how do we think creatively about how we can capture the data that archaeologists want and need to answer archaeological questions? That's really and that's been by far the most fun of this whole project. That's part of what was so gratifying to see that video, as I was saying, of Kayla doing that, to see how we're taking just the most basic idea of the test pit and translating it in a useful way that allows us to systematically record the material culture of a space habitat for the first time, and provides us with data that we can then put us to the side or together with all those historical photos that we're also using. Because on the one hand, the historical photos are much more abundant and cover a much vaster span of time, and also the entire space station, but they're random. They were not recorded for our needs or with the idea of this is going to be ISS material culture. So now we're adding the scientific systematic process of archaeological data recording. So that will reveal something about how we should be interpreting the historical photos. And likewise, the vast array of historical photos will help us to interpret the systematic photos.
Oscar, you have a question.
Yes, hello, Justin. It's always great to hear you talk.
Hi, Oscar. How are you?
Good. So I have a question for you regarding an aspect of space culture that is right on Earth, which is like analog research, right? So, we're working on a station, we're working on starting building a station and stuff. And I've had the personal opportunity to be at stations such as HISES and MDRS, which in themselves have a lot of interesting like backgrounds in terms, for example, of like doing research. Like HISES is occurring in a Hawaiian territory, right? But that's another discussion.
Right.
But my question was more about like this aspect of space culture in an analog. Like, do you think, because there are processes like the same camaraderie occurs within crews.
And conflict probably
Yeah,
as well.
and conflict, of course. And it is kind of a window of what would be this, like that's kind of the goal of analog research. So what is your position on that? What is would you see merit on doing this kind of research in such an environment?
In recording the material culture of an analog habitat. So that's what you're asking, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so just to explain for everybody, if you're not aware, there are these various research stations all over the world. So they're in Hawaii and there's one in Colombia, right, Oscar, that you're associated with?
Yeah, we're starting building it right now, yes.
And there's one in Brazil. There's one active in Russia right now. I was just reading the story before I came on to do this lecture, where there's 6 people, including 2 Americans, who are in a habitat from November until, I don't know, like July. And they probably or might not even be aware of what's going on in Ukraine. And they're locked in this habitat. So there are people who are participating in these, what are called analog habitats, that are used to help understand what the long-term effects, other than microgravity, radiation, and the kind of specific contextual problems of being in space might be, like crew compatibility and these kinds of things. So yes, I do think that there would be value in doing them. Oscar, I think you had been mentioning, could we do some sort of like square research in the Colombian habitat? And I was talking about that with Alice, and it occurred to me that square really relies on there not being gravity in a sense. And so, where would you place squares in a 1G habitat where you would expect to capture items? I'm not like on tables, I guess. But other than tables, where else would you put them? Walls are not going to be used in the same way in an analog 1G habitat that they're used in a 0G habitat or a micro G habitat. So I mean, these things don't necessarily translate back to Earth, but there's absolutely studies we could do with directed photography or historic photography, or with interviews, or sampling the environment in various ways that we could apply and then use as comparison with something like ISS. I would think it would be absolutely important to get as many kind of examples of trying to contend with what it means to live in space as possible. So I'm hoping not only the analog thing, but can we extend ISAP to Lunar Gateway, the coming space station that's going to go into orbit around the moon, or to the commercial space stations that are being built by Axiom, Blue Origin, Sierra, et cetera, NanoRacks, et cetera. Right. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Any
you.
last question? Ken has had to step out, so I'll close our proceedings here. Does anybody else have a question?
Is there anything in the chat? I can't really see the chat at the moment.
No, not at the moment.
Okay.
Okay, well, I want to thank Justin for taking the time this evening to give us such a wonderful talk. We will be posting this on our AIA YouTube page. And again, really appreciate you, Justin, doing this for us. And I wish you the best of luck. And I look forward to hearing in the future, about how things develop, and, draw upon our community and other archaeologists as much as possible. And, we'll be glad to pitch in.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I put the slide back up just in case anybody wants to reach out, or you can check out we have a brand new blog post about how we're recording data in Square on our website. You can follow us on Twitter at ISS Archaeology. I'm pretty active there. And feel free to email me if you have questions.
Yeah, I think we'll stick all that in the links below the lecture on YouTube. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, everyone have a great night and we'll see you soon.
Awesome. Thank you.